Hello, I'm Gordon Buchanan and welcome to Beneath the Baobab, the Conservation and Communities podcast from JAMA International. In this series, we're exploring the vital connection between communities and wildlife in conservation projects in Africa and around the world. And today, for my last episode of the series, we're much closer to home, certainly closer to my home. I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Daniels. Mike is the Director of Policy at the John Muir Trust, a Scottish-based charitable organisation that's going to be celebrating its 40th birthday next year. The ambitions of the Trust, in their words, are to support wild places where nature, people and communities have the freedom to thrive. And those three elements have been a constant in this podcast series too, no matter where we have visited in the world over previous episodes. I'm excited to explore some of the similarities between the conservation challenges we've heard so much about in Africa and problems we're facing right here on our doorstep. The John Muir Trust owns and cares for some of the most breathtaking wild places in Scotland, including the summit of Ben Nevis and part of the Cuillins on Skye. In recent times, they've also taken on the land management of Glenridding Common in England's Lake District. As you'll hear from Mike, the political and land ownership situation in Scotland means that the Trust approaches its goals in a way relatively unique to the country. As you can probably hear, I'm not in the studio today to speak with Mike. We're on location at one of their sites in the Breadalbane Mountains. So for the last time this series, I'd like to invite you to join me as we talk conservation beneath the Baobab. So we're in East Schiehallion, Perthshire. How would you describe this landscape in front of us for podcast listeners?
Yeah, so this is really typical what you'd expect to see in Scotland. There's a heathery covered hill with some woodland around it, and it's just turning into the beautiful autumn golds that we get at this time of year.
Yeah. I do like this time of year. We did part of the West Highland Way 2 years ago this week, and yeah, something about just getting out at this time of year when the colours are changing. It is without a doubt the most dramatic time of year, and the weather as well. I think in Scotland you've just got to take it as it is. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and there's a bit of cloud there at the moment, but Schiehallion is quite far east. One of the hills that actually you can probably climb and get a view on most days. But it's always a changing weather.
And for Schiehallion, it's close to the Central Belt, probably one of the kind of closest Monroes to Glasgow and Edinburgh. So is it the busiest mountain in Scotland?
Probably not. I mean, Ben Nevis, which the John Muir Trust also manages, is probably the most famous and the busiest. But yes, it's certainly really popular, and you can see from the car park it's full every day, really, all through the year, which is great. And it's we've worked a lot on this path. It's a relatively easy path for people to climb and for folk with kids and families to come up and experience.
It seems in sort of across my lifetime, I used to go hill walking kind of, through my teens and 20s, but it does seem that there's a lot more people taking to the hills nowadays. Is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, I think more recently the demographic it was a stage, I think, where it was kind of people of a certain age who were doing it, but it seems to be getting more popular and more variety of people. So when we first took over this property, there was a big muddy track, and we've spent almost £1 million on a footpath. And yeah, it's a bit of a challenge, because on the one hand you want people to experience things naturally and wild, and on the other hand you have to manage impacts. Yeah, people need a car park, and they need a toilet, and they need a footpath. But there's still plenty of places they can wander off and backpack and camp themselves.
It's money well spent. It's a very good footpath, I have to say.
Yep.
So this year it's a 40th anniversary of the John Muir Trust. And I suppose the interesting thing, what I find very inspiring around the world is these sort of, how, community and conservation and sort of land ownership, how these things can sort of interface with each other, and how it can actually benefit, a kind of wider community. And that's what's happening with the Trust.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So, the John Muir Trust was founded, bizarrely actually, just after the Falklands War, when there was a move to buy a piece of Knoydart and turn it into a bombing range. And at the time that was kind of seen, these places were just, they were kind of miles of nothing, and it didn't really matter what you did with them. And there was a group of people who said, no, this is really a stunning place, and actually a local community. There were some people living there wasn't so many people living there, but also people that visited, hill walkers, and they set up this trust to try and buy that land to protect it. And at the time that was quite kind of radical, but 40 years on, that's actually land reform in Scotland has really moved on, and community ownership is quite a growing movement, and the idea of respecting the environment, is kind of taking place in terms of policy, with whether it's biodiversity or climate change. So kind of things have moved, but it was, the trust was quite at the forefront of that.
And that's the interesting thing in Scotland. I don't know how unique it is around the world, how much of Scottish land is in private hands.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people living in Scotland aren't aware of the issues surrounding land ownership. How would you sort of try and summarise that, sort of how Scotland is owned and who owns it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and it's really key, and it's interestingly, even our national parks, about 80% of our land is owned privately, and by a relatively small number of people, maybe about 400 people by some estimates. So there's a tiny number of people own a huge part of the country, and that's quite unusual. It's a very concentrated pattern of ownership, which is different than pretty much a lot of other countries. And then about 10% is owned by ourselves, as in the state, whether it's forestry land or Scottish Natural Heritage. And then the other 2% is owned by ENGOs like the John Muir Trust, and another 2 or 3% now is owned by communities, and that is growing. And I think that has a big impact on the way land is managed. So there's 4 things that decide how land is managed. One is incentives, whether people get paid to do something. One is regulation, whether they're stopped from doing something. Another is culture, and actually in Scotland we've got quite a bizarre and unique culture, this sort of Victorian hunting culture, which has permeated a lot of what happens. And then the other fourth one is ownership, and I guess that's the one that, so by changing ownership and diversifying ownership, the hope is that we can regenerate both communities and ecologies.
Yeah. And as you explained earlier on, we're kind of the epicentre of this patchwork of ownership right here. How is this land divided up, and who owns it?
Yeah, so exactly where we sit in the heart of Scotland here, we've got we're on this conservation owned land, and right beside us here to that side we've got a community landowner, Duncoilich, and then behind us we've got Forestry Land Scotland, which is a state owned, and then we're surrounded by big private estates. So we've got all the microcosm of all the different types of ownership right here. And we're working in a partnership with all those interests to try and regenerate the woodland in this area, and the sort of society that is based on that.
And is that a shared common goal with all the landowners here to regenerate woodland?
So I think we've all got slightly different aims, but that's the thread that holds us together. I think there is a recognition that we need much more woodland, we need more biodiversity, and these everyone's got a slightly different flavour of how they do that. So obviously Forest Land Scotland have got to generate timber at some point as well as public goods. We are more interested in the wildness of this area. The community they're interested in how communities benefit, and then the private estates, they still want to maintain some hunting and sporting on it, but they are interested in increasing the woodland and the ecology. Yeah.
Just off to our left, that's something that I like to see. It's a woodland sort of part way through restoration, looks a lot more kind of as nature intended, and a lot less like a lot of the Highlands of Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting. You can see, as I say, all around here, there's what we tend to think of a woodland as that big sort of block, which is just a row of conifers, whereas actually this native woodland here that's coming away is much more natural. You get patchy, big bare patches, you get different age structure, you get standing deadwood, you get diversity, which of course is what nature loves most, rather than just one uniform stand.
And is that sort of, so there's just a mixture of pine and birch, and is heather still growing up kind of on the ground? Has that been planted, or is that natural regeneration?
So it's both. I mean, I think it was planted to kickstart it, and then once you reduce the herbivores, either with fencing or culling the deer, then the seeds will start to come in and it will regenerate as well.
So for John Muir Trust, or this area specifically, what are the long-term goals?
Yeah, so I mean, our kind of real long-term goals, if you like, is we want to see 3 freedoms: the freedom for nature to do its own thing, the freedom for people to come and enjoy it, and the freedom for communities to benefit. So in this case, really, this starts with the soil and the plants and the animals. So we've got pretty much a bit of a monoculture of, one-dimensional heather here, really, with some bracken in this area, whereas really we should have a whole range of woodland scrub. We're starting to see over there some willows coming in, and right up to a natural tree line of montane woodland. And I think once we start to get that, all those ecosystems, kind of repairing, the opportunities for people are much more. So you could start to imagine a situation where you have, timber. You could possibly have, huts where people stay. You can have mountain bike trails, a whole lot of things which you can't have just in a bare hill. So that's our kind of long-term aim. But our primary aim is really getting the woodland back to its natural tree line, really, which is a really ambitious thing, because the natural tree line in most of Scotland is pretty much, at the summits of the hills. I mean, it's up at 2,500 feet.
Because if you look off to the right to those higher slopes, I kind of hate to call it a classic Scottish scene, but that is how much of the Highlands of Scotland looks. You're hard pushed to find a single tree. It's sort of a monoculture of grasses and heather. And that's a long history of, firstly, people burning and cutting down trees, but then actually came deer. People were cleared off the land to have hunting estates with lots of deer, high deer population, which we still have the legacy of. And then that was followed by sheep, and it's become, as each of these cultures came in, it became that becomes seen as the cultural norm of a shifting baseline. And people think, there's always been sheep here, or there's always been deer here. But actually it's a relatively short window particularly in the last 300 or 400 years, that's created a lot of the damage we see now. Yeah. You previously worked for the Deer Commission, and you mentioned the deer problem. A lot of people go, well, what is the deer problem?
Yeah, so
other than there being way too many of them, but that's something I know.
So it's a cultural and ecological problem. So culturally, it comes from the fact that, as I say, we had this Victorian sporting legacy which was really kind of, the Victorians really reinvented a lot of society. So they kind of brought back tartan, and they kind of pretty much extirpated Gaelic from the east of the country. They did a whole lot of things in sort of social engineering. I mean, inadvertently or deliberately, I don't know. But one of the ones was creating this idea of a kind of sporting estate. So a big area where you had, lots of deer or grouse, and the wealthy landowner came and shot them for fun for literally a few weeks in the year. And that kind of became the thing to have. So industrialists that made money, it was the equivalent of owning a football club nowadays. That was the sort of the social status to own an estate. So these estates were created all over the Highlands, and they were ironically called deer forests. There was no trees in them, but they were kind of hunting forests. And a lot of people were moved off the land to make room for them. And the deer numbers and the grouse numbers started to respond, partly because a lot of the predators were, not so much in the case of the deer, but in terms of the grouse, the predators were hit pretty hard. Everything else was managed to encourage them. And so that's really the heart of the problem. And then from then on, the deer numbers have really kind of been maintained pretty high. And the value of these estates, the capital value, has maintained that as a lifestyle and as a way of managing, seen as a normal way of managing the country over a huge area, to the point that the deer population is probably hovering around about 1 million in Scotland now. And there's one of the first ecologists, Frank Fraser-Darling, in the 1960s, kind of estimated that a population of around 60,000 in the Highlands is probably too many. Whereas we're now 10 times that number. So it's a massive problem, and it's a really unnaturally high density compared to natural herbivore deer populations elsewhere.
No, I've seen that in different parts of the world, in Europe and North America. Deer are quite hard to find in a more natural environment, and I think in Scotland, it's hard to drive an hour or two through the Highlands without seeing signs of them. And I was up an estate just north of here, and it wasn't a huge area, and I was speaking to the gamekeeper, and he was lamenting over the fact that the landowner decided to kind of reduce the deer numbers massively. So we used to have 4,000 deer on this one mountain. I'm looking at a habitat that simply cannot support that number of animals.
Deer are not, the roe deer and the red deer are native natural species, and we totally recognise they're fantastic animals in their own right. They're part of the ecosystem, but they're also keystone species, and they can change the habitat. So deer can change if they're not kept at low numbers, they can change woodland to grassland and heather to grassland, and they can kind of start to erode. And then they have these big unnatural die-offs. There's like, every spring in Scotland you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of deer lying dead, which isn't really natural. It's because their populations are so high and they can't get the shelter.
Well, that's the thing, I suppose. A landscape like this, where you've had people felling trees, and then that absence of predators, high deer numbers, sheep numbers, and woodland recovery on its own is not possible.
Yeah. So you just need something to kickstart it. So I mean, there's either fencing, which kind of treats the symptoms but not the cause, or there's just culling and bringing the numbers down. And then ultimately, at some point, once the numbers are down, potentially natural predators could help do some of the job. At the moment, the densities are just so high that that's not really going to make any difference at the moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of NGOs and organisations in Scotland, there is that sort of, common realisation that there are too many deer, and if you want sort of woodland recovery and restoration, you have to reduce deer numbers. I suppose for the actual kind of animal welfare as well, as you said, there's thousands and thousands of deer dying through starvation and lack of shelter in the end of the winter.
Yeah, and it is a really unnatural situation we've got, and in order to get this kind of habitat and landscape back to anything like where it was or what it could be, and for the future, as well as being adapted to climate change, we need to really restore a lot of the natural vegetation, and that requires bringing the herbivore numbers down.
Be interesting. So that if I've got my time machine here and we go back, say 10,000-12,000 years, and we're walking along this little part of Scotland, what would we be seeing right now?
Gosh, yeah, I mean, pretty much a huge range of species that aren't here, unfortunately. So whether that's whether there's the predators, the lynx, the bears, the wolves, the herbivores, the oryx, the beavers, all these things that are would have been here in a much more rich mosaic of woodland. You can imagine you'd have oak woodland in the lower slopes, you'd have gone right up to mountain birch. So yeah, we've pretty much lost a lot of things over that period.
Yeah. And in reality, if this was 10,000 years ago, we'd be walking through a woodland. We wouldn't be able to see the sort of slopes of Schiehallion. We wouldn't be able to look off behind us and see those hills further north. It's a very almost, I think, unrecognisable. It's not a world that people would associate with kind of being, a Scottish scene.
Yeah, and yet bizarrely, if you go to other parts of Europe where the deer numbers are lower and there's natural predators, if you're in Slovenia or Norway, or not without their problems, but you get woodland as a natural. It's the climax vegetation is what we should have, and you have it it's a much more patchy, mixed, all sorts of different types of woodland. So. Yeah, I think we're demonstrating that we can very, very quickly and easily bring the woodland back. It just requires a bit of a kickstart, either some planting trees or fencing or reducing the herbivores, and then the tree numbers start to come back, and the woodland starts to recover.
So, are we kind of walking from one owner to the next through this gate, or is it? This is
part of our. Yeah, so we've got a fenced offset electric fence here to try and keep the deer out of this bit while we move towards trying to address the deer problem across the whole estate. So we've managed to get natural regeneration in this section.
Is that sort of a controversial topic in the kind of wider community?
Ironically, the biggest controversy is between more traditional deer managers and conservation deer managers. So traditional stalkers and gamekeepers and deer managers want to really have high numbers of deer. So when they've got a guest coming out, and they can pretty much guarantee that the guest will be able to shoot something because there's so many deer around, and no matter what the weather. Whereas as conservationists, deer managers, we want to have the numbers really low. We want deer to be there, but you want them to be, as you said earlier on, so you're really lucky when you see one. It's quite a scarce thing. And that way the habitat will be able to recover.
So much of Scotland is owned by private landowners with sporting interests. Is that, and I'm aware that is a relationship that's been kind of fairly controversial sort of in my lifetime. Are kind of people moving on to the same page, or is it the same arguments over kind of high deer numbers and sort of return of woodland?
The same arguments are rehearsed, and the same controversy is still there. But what is changing is the ownership patterns, if you like. So that there's partly, as we discussed earlier, there's part of this community ownership is taking over. So or is taking off. So there's a lot more communities now involved in owning land, and their primary interest isn't so much in sport shooting. That's not their main interest. But there's also a change in private landowners. There's quite a few of the biggest landowner in Scotland now is interested in conservation rather than purely in sport shooting. So that change is happening. And then the third change really is through legislation. So there's a real urgency in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity, and in terms of land reform. And the current government in Scotland is legislating on all three. And all three, the direction of travel is much more in terms of trying to diversify ownership, trying to manage land for conservation and climate, and there's not really a public objective about sport shooting. That's not something that's really kind of ticking many public interest boxes in itself. But recognising that we need to control deer, and we need people to cull deer, and that hunting is the only way to do that, as you say.
Well, I suppose it's that changing culture, and this sort of traditional deer management and traditional sporting estates in Scotland. That's a kind of culture that's 100 years old, and we're living in a very different world now. The concerns of young people are very different, and it is about restoring nature, realising the kind of importance when we're in a climate emergency, how important it is that we preserve and restore what we have, and for the future of our planet.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's just, I guess as people look more at, scrutinise more how we use the land, and who benefits from it, questions have to be asked as to why would a private estate manage something for shooting a small number of deer at a few weeks in the year? Is that really socially acceptable when we've got all these other things that can be done and need to be done with land? Yeah,
it seems, thankfully, that we're kind of living in an era that people are not just thinking what can you take out from the land, but what can you return to it, for the future health of our planet. And just to pick back up on the community land ownership, we're looking off to the left, and even at a distance of a few hundred metres, you can see all of that regrowth of trees. It looks a much healthier place. It looks much more natural. You've got a kind of increased biodiversity even at this sort of stage of recovery. When it comes to that's a community project, what's the story there? How did that come about?
Yeah, so that was a piece of land that came up for sale, and some local people decided, well, it'd be great to buy that, and it would be great to turn that into a project to recreate woodland. But on the back of that, also engage in, they've got an apprenticeship scheme where there's young people learn rural skills and try and make it deliver again for both community and ecology. And a similar thing that we're doing ourselves here. So I think ENGOs are, if you like, are a community of interest. And again, similarly, where we want to try and maximise the ecological potential of the land, but also the people's involvement through visiting and through whether they can involve in. We're actually looking at community hunting now as one method that we can try and democratise deer management in a way. Yeah, so
community hunting, that sounds like an interesting concept. What does that entail?
Yeah, so I guess the typical hunting model we have in the moment in these private estates is a paying guest who comes out, and he's taken out with a stalker and a ghillie, and spends a day, shoots one deer and brings it home, and that's kind of the model. So that's it's a model, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't really help in terms of bringing numbers down. And it doesn't really involve a lot of people. If somebody flies in, or they're just there up on holiday or something as a guest. What we're trying to look at is, can we involve people in the local community longer term, once the numbers are down, to try and be involved in being able to go and access. So if they've got the skills and they're trained and they're able to do it, could we have a calendar where they basically divide up the calendar, and you can book yourself in and come in for a day. You can go and shoot a deer on the hill, and you can cut it up and take it back into your freezer. And it's kind of like the way it used to be in the past.
Yeah.
People used to just take a deer for the pot, as it were. But it's just trying to make that much more accessible. And with that, hopefully people will then have a better understanding of the way land is managed, because a lot of rural communities in Scotland are pretty much remote and disenfranchised from the private estate. They're not really involved in it. They just see it as a backdrop. So to actually involve people in the management of it is really important. Also, obviously they can get some protein, and it's pretty low carbon footprint. They're just getting it from the back door. It's pretty organic and healthy. And also they can hopefully then start to kind of really get to grips with the whole deer woodland debate and understand and see what happens, that to get healthy, big, nice, fat deer, you need healthy woodland, whereas the deer we have tend to be quite scrawny and starved and living, in exposed conditions. It's the whole sort of culture and land ownership pattern we had. So with this Victorianisation and creation of these private estates, most people, they were cleared off the land, or their connection with the land was discouraged, and so we've lost that kind of woodland culture, hunting culture, any culture of land stewardship. And actually Scotland has got one of the most urban concentration population in Europe as well. So 80-90% of people live in the central belt, and a very sparse population in the rural areas, unlike actually in Ireland or even in England. So the result of that is that people don't really have much connection with the land. And even in a rural village like where I live, there's a couple of big estates round about it, big landowners, but very few people actually work on the land, and so most people live there just don't really know what's going on, or aren't involved in it. And I think that kind of needs to change, really, so people have more of a sense of ownership and management and responsibility.
Yeah. Rewilding is something that is kind of concept that kind of seems to be on lots of people's lips. I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding about, what that means. You living in a kind of rural part of Scotland, does the term rewilding strike fear into the hearts of people, or is it something they see as a positive force?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So in terms of on the rewilding side, I think certainly within everyone I've ever spoken to involved in rewilding, or using that word, is very clear that it's about rewilding people. It's not about clearing people, it's about ecological restoration and community restoration. But it's either misinterpreted deliberately or inadvertently as being something a bit more sort of, not to do with people. And for that reason, it can be quite controversial. Yeah, certainly we use it sparingly and sensitively. It's not a word, but on the other hand, it is a word that's being used more and more commonly, and probably is kind of getting a bit more sort of recognition. But it's still probably seen rurally as a bit pejorative, and it's seen as being something that's being done to people rather than they're doing themselves. Whereas genuinely, I don't think that's the intention of anyone that uses the phrase.
Well, I think you look at Scotland's history and how the land was cleared of people to make way for sheep farming, and that was obviously kind of a huge controversy of kind of Scotland's history. So you don't want to kind of have anything that has those connotations where actually you're kind of putting the needs of another species before the needs of people.
Yeah, totally. I think there's two elements. One is that as we said, wild places and wild land and wilderness, and all these terms are all kind of slightly loaded in the sense that we talk about clearances, and Scotland and the UK has always been heavily populated, and so most places were lived in, whether it was summer Schiehallions or whether it was communities, and so the concept of making it wild again, rewilding it can seem slightly disingenuous because there were people there. But and then equally, I think the idea of going back to a certain point in time isn't is seen as sort of non-progressive. So the idea of saying what was it like 1,000 years ago, whereas again actually what we need is much more resilience and adaptation for what's in the future. We've got climate change coming down the tracks, we've got temperatures warming, we're going to need different species, we're going to need adaptability, we've got flash flooding and soil erosion, all these things. So actually it's much more about the future than the past.
Yeah.
But it is about putting nature back at the centre and recognising that we are all dependent on the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soils that we grow our food on, and that to mismanage them and to treat them badly as we have done for centuries just isn't, we can't go on that way, really.
Yeah. I spotted a tree. Yeah, there's sort of in amongst this, so we've got heather and bracken, dry grasses here, but is there a seed bed of trees in this area? If you kind of reduced grazing, would the forest naturally come back?
So some species definitely would. In birch particularly, the seeds travel quite a long way, and there's a great seed source just over there. There's some aspen and birch that are just lurking in that gully down there. But some of the other species, our aspirations here really is to get a mountain woodland right to the top of the skyline, and there's a whole suite of species that are missing. So there's juniper, dwarf birch, some of the montane willows that are snowbed, like the snow. So we're going to have to get locally grown seeds and then get people to plant them up. and ideally maybe get folk that are climbing up the hill to carry some seeds up for us to help that process and to get engaged in it. But yeah, so that with time, a lot of the other species will start to come in slowly. But and actually bracken's a really good indicator that the soil is quite rich. So there, actually there would have been oaks and things growing in the bracken soil. So yeah, but we need to give it a helping hand really by bringing some of the seeds in.
Yeah, and it seems these days there's more and more people that are wanting to get involved in that type of project, and if you can use the local community to help restore that natural environment, it does sort of reinforce that connection with the land.
Definitely, and I think there's a bit of a understandably anxiety and depression about the whole situation and the feeling of powerlessness. So to be able to do something, planting a tree is a really positive thing. You feel you're doing something to help, and people are really keen to do that, but also feel they're taking action. And yes, as you say, there's that connection then locally with the land and being able to do something help the land around you.
So a landscape like this, sort of all being well, it could come back in 40 years' time and it would look very different.
Absolutely. I mean, what you'd really hope to start to see is the woodland creeping up the hill, and with time, I think in 20, 30, 40 years you'll see a big difference. And it's a process. Once it starts, I mean, some of the soil here is limestone, is quite rich, but other bits are quite peaty and acidic. But when you get the first leaf fall from the birch, that just starts to enrich the soil a little bit. And then that soil starts to build up, and then you get other seeds coming away, and it just needs that helping hand to get it going, and then it'll all really starts to kick in. And
that helping hand in kick-starting that process is kind of planting trees initially, but you're going to have to enclose this area to keep the sheep and the deer out. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, the deer control we can do and we can manage, but the sheep are more challenging because they're. A lot of Scotland, again, they're quite extensive, so they're not really fenced in, so they wander over the ground, and we own half a mountain here, literally, up to this. So unless we own the whole mountain, we can't really keep the sheep out. So the sheep come in, so we need to basically fence them out to get this process started. How many miles of fencing is required to protect a mountainside like this? Yeah, it'll be a good few kilometres, but we try and do it. We're using this offset electric fencing, so we're trying to do it as sensitively as possible. And then also try and follow the contours around, so you're avoiding the, big straight lines. Try and make it. But I mean, again, it's not in an ideal world. Nobody really wants to fence. We just see fence as a really temporary solution. So that's what I like about walking through the hills in Scotland. You just go sort of over one little rise, and the whole landscape changes again. Yeah, and you can see. I don't know if you can see the aspen there, that flaming aspen, beautiful. But this is a typical thing again, that we've got a gorge here that the sheep and the deer haven't been able to get in, and those trees are just hanging in there for centuries. There's fantastic oaks and birch and aspen all just living in there, and they just need a chance to come out, and they'll creep back up the hillsides here. It's quite an interesting scene, this, because we're kind of seeing kind of modern Scotland. It's a landscape that's partially being restored. There's commercial timber off in the background, sort of right there in the horizon I can see that wind farm. So this sort of, we talk about change in Scotland, and that change never really stops since people have been living on these islands. Change is part of life. Yeah, and we've got evidence of sort of occupation here since the Bronze Age, and I say we've gone through all these different fads, whether it's sport shooting, whether it's sheep farming the wind in terms of wind farms, and hopefully what we're really needing now is an era of ecological restoration. We really need to try and get back to where we started and try and restore this landscape. John Muir Trust, the vision for not just here at Schiehallion, but it's a long-term vision. What would you like to see John Muir's legacy being another 40 years from now? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, as environmental charities, ENGOs, we kind of really want to see ourselves not existing, in the sense that what you're advocating for has become mainstream and accepted, and people are all, so you don't need it, is the ideal. But in the absence of that, I think what we're saying is that we think people need to really recognise that they are part of nature, and that wild places are really key to their daily existence, but also to their mental health, and that there'll be much more recognition that that there's a movement in
there's a movement to try and get 30% of our land protected. I mean, at the moment we're way below that. Wouldn't it be great to have 50% of the planet, or some much bigger area that actually nature is in its primacy and nature takes precedent, and that people are benefiting from that rather than just exploiting it.
One slightly depressing thing when you spend time in wild parts of Scotland, you see how much needs to be done, and it's not just about deer control, not just about land management. It's about the future, and about the future of our planet. And obviously with a climate emergency, with carbon emissions, we're kind of governments, institutions, businesses are looking at a way of reducing carbon. When it comes to sort of your strategy, or John Muir Trust strategy, what are the issues around that and the regulations that are coming into force?
Yeah, so I think as you say, we think these things are all connected, and I guess what we're advocating for is a tax on land, on carbon emissions from land. So it would be quite a unique approach. It hasn't been tried elsewhere, but there are talks about carbon taxes, obviously for carbon heavy industries, or that already exists. But why not actually look at the land and see how much carbon is being emitted and rate that, and then pay a tax on that? And that would do a couple of things. One, it would nudge people towards better behaviour, because it, plastic bag tax or alcohol tax, it kind of changes behaviour. And also the money it would generate, it would could be used for ecological restoration, for peatland schemes or woodland schemes. I said right at the beginning, you need a combination of regulation and incentives to change behaviour. And so ideally, yes, you want people to do voluntary things, and you want people to do the right thing, and you want to try and encourage them and give money for that. But actually, at the end of the day, you need to regulate it as well. You need to say, well, actually, we just can't let this happen. And so one way of doing it is taxation. One way is regulating deer numbers. And I think without that, the changes are just being the whims of whether people want to do them or not.
It's been a privilege to chat with Mike and to see firsthand the great work going on in East Schiehallion. The way he's building on the decades of success stewarded by the John Muir Trust has been really inspiring to see. Community ownership, engagement and land management has enriched the wildlife and landscape of Scotland to the benefit of everyone and everything. And with such a vision for the future, I'm excited to see how these landscapes and communities continue to grow and develop. Our conversation laid bare the issues that present themselves when local communities feel disempowered by their own governmental or international policies. It would appear that there have been tremendous strides forward in decentralisation already, with more power being put into the hands of those who live on the land. If you'd like to find out more about the John Muir Trust, take a look at the links in the show notes, or just visit the website jamainternational.com to explore more amazing international collaborations way beyond where I am today in rural Perthshire. Make sure you follow or subscribe to this podcast on your favourite app. JAMA International are passionate about conservation and well-being for people and planet, and know it's crucial to open positive dialogues and share ideas. If you'd like to share this podcast, please do so with the hashtag #BeneathTheBaobab on social media, or maybe just start a conversation with a friend. Thank you so much to all of our listeners who have supported this podcast by listening in this series. We hope that you found these stories as uplifting, inspiring, and as full of hope as we have recording them. Thank you again for joining us beneath the Baobab.